Hello, everybody. I'm Maria Ressa. Welcome to hashtag Hold the Line. Today, I'm really thrilled to be talking to an amazing woman who embodies holding the line. Yael Eisenstat is a former CIA officer, former diplomat, former national security advisor to former Vice President Joseph Biden. A lot of formers. Last big former is, and it's a long title, the Global Head of Elections Integrity Operations for Political Ads for Facebook, a post that she lasted in for about 6 months. This is a woman who holds the line. Yael, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. I mean, I'm honored to be here with the person who truly embodies holding the line.
You first. Thank you. I've been watching your work for a long time, especially after you were named, the global head of elections integrity partnerships at Facebook. Because I thought, wow, here's a woman who worked on counterterrorism, who understands the public sphere. I guess the first question is, why did you only last 6 months?
If that, it was just under 6 months. When I started speaking with the Facebook recruiters about this role, it's because I had already started speaking publicly about how I felt social media was affecting democracy. I had shifted my entire career from focusing on counter extremism and national security issues overseas, because I'm a global thinker, to really drilling down on what was happening in the US in that moment, because I just felt like this breakdown in discourse was dangerous. And that was, 2015, I started speaking out about it and digging in and trying to figure out what was going on. So when Facebook started speaking with me, I wasn't somebody fresh out of school who really was dying to work at Facebook. I was very clear with the recruiters. This is who I am. I am interested in this role because I think you guys have the most profound possible impact on democracy right now. It was 2018. It was just after the Cambridge Analytica scandal had become really public. And I was pretty clear, though. I didn't, some people will say whatever they need to say to make a company want to hire them. I was the opposite. I said this, I'm going to dig in. I'm going to look under the rug. I need to understand what happened and how we got here. And if you want somebody who's just going to come in on day one and say, here are all my ideas to fix this, that's not me. If you want someone to come in on day one and say, let me learn how we got here for real and take my time to really figure out what to do, then hire me. So they said everything I needed to hear. And within one day, I was already completely disempowered. Like they changed my title on my second day. They changed my job description on the second day. And I understand that the Facebook mentality is people are just dying to work here. So once they get in the door, they'll just be part of our, company and they'll be thrilled with anything. No, you hired me to help you fix how people are manipulating the platform to affect elections. If that's not what you're going to have me do, then I'm out. So anyway, long story short, they hired me for everything that I bring to the table. And then they pushed me into a corner and silenced me because of everything I bring to the table. So yeah, they weren't serious about me. And they, it's really interesting. The people I worked with were all really excited about the things I was trying to push, the questions I was asking. But higher up, there was no appetite for the things I was pushing on.
So I have two follow-ups that are related to that, I guess. Where is that moment where you obviously draw your lines? Where is the line that you crossed where you said, all right, that's it? And then connected to that, why was it so important for you to be effective at that job? What is the biggest problem that you were working on or still are working on?
Still am. So yeah, to the first point, it's interesting. I've had tough roles before. I've worked for some of the most complicated places and complicated organizations in the world. And yet I constantly was being bombarded with what I believe is intentional confusion at Facebook, just to keep my hair on fire all the time. And at some point I kept saying, but I'm going to keep doing this because there are people here who really want to make this difference. And maybe if I could just get away from these particular managers or this particular person, I can affect change. So I did two things. I put a calendar notice in my iPhone for 6 months to the date of me being hired. And I wrote 4 things. And I said, if these 4 things haven't changed by this date, you walk. And I should have brought it up before this because I can't remember exactly what they were, but I was very clear. I said, if I'm not empowered to do my job, if I am not working with a team that supports me, like I wrote this out for myself. I've never done that before, but it was that bad there. And so I have to be empowered. I have to have a seat at the table. I have to be supported. It was never, I have to be right. It was never what I'm doing must happen. It was more about, do they want me and am I going to affect change here? So first of all, I did that. I gave myself a deadline because it is very easy to keep saying, but if I stay one more month, if I stay one more month. And so secondly, I did. I went to HR and I said at some point, probably around month 3 or 4, you hired me to do this job. I care deeply about the mission of protecting our democracy. Find a different part of Facebook for me to work in where I can do what you hired me to do and give me the opportunity to be successful. And if not, I have to leave. So I also laid down that marker. Everything, of course, got worse after that because then they figured out how to get rid of me. But so yeah, that was, and just for what it's worth, I think people need to understand it's not, I know that my name is out there a lot right now. So it's hard for people to understand that was a financially very difficult decision for me.
Yes, for everyone.
I mean,
Facebook.
Well, I guess not for everyone, but I didn't have a big savings account. I lived in a 1-bedroom in New York and was just, I'm a former public servant. I am not, but it was too important. And so I walked. I mean, they kind of fired me after I threatened to quit, but I wouldn't sign the non-disparagement agreement and I wouldn't take the severance. Otherwise, you and I couldn't have this conversation. So that's more important to me. Maintaining both my integrity and the ability to continue to work on these issues meant saying no to the paperwork. So the biggest thing, there is no one thing. It's to be crystal clear. I'm going to just say this, even though I'm sure you already know this. I am not saying that Facebook in and of itself is responsible for everything that's wrong in our democracy. It is one piece of the puzzle. And just because that's what I work on does not mean that I do not recognize all of the other parts of the ecosystem that play into this. This is like one of the biggest things to knock people like us down is to say, oh, but what about? Yes, there's lots of different pieces. This is the piece I'm working on. And no matter what, all of the things you see happening around companies, especially Facebook, I will say especially Facebook because they've made intentional political decisions. And that's the difference. Right? Like Twitter's made mistakes, no question. Yeah. And they will continue, and I will continue to criticize them. Yeah. But I see a company that is truly struggling to figure out how do we continue to be a social media platform and a tech company while also thinking about how we're impacting democracy. Whereas Facebook has made intentional political decisions that have affected how they interact with authoritarians around the world, how they interact with different actors around the world. So that I cannot forgive or accept. And so I will continue to push and I will continue to work on figuring out how to define accountability for how these companies affect democracy and societies and young children and all of these externalities, because we have never defined accountability for this industry in the US. And they export it to the rest of the world because we haven't defined accountability. This is how they operate globally. So that was sort of a long answer, but no small challenges.
No, it's great. And I want to drill down just a little bit more because I talk a lot about death by 1,000 cuts of democracy. Actually, you bring it up. You made me think of death by 1,000 cuts of integrity, of morality, right? I know I have friends like you. I think there are really good people trying to do the job inside Facebook, but they're sidelined. And people who have left have said they can't talk because it's financially bad for them if they did, right? So, and you talked about what you gave up. What is it? This is a show called Hold the Line. What is it about you that made you turn away money, power? Because there's so few who do.
It's who I've always been. This is a question I've been sitting with over the last few years because it's another thing people don't understand about someone like me. My goal is not to be famous. My goal is not to be on CNN. My gosh, I actually hate being a public facing person. I'm an operator. I want to be behind the scenes getting things done. And the reason I bring that up is so I have thought a lot about this, like this role that I'm in now of sort of being this public facing person while still working on some of these issues behind the scenes. For me, from a very young age, it's just who I am. I mean, I grew up in the Silicon Valley, which people don't realize about me. And when I was 15 years old, 15 in the 80s, in Silicon Valley, I already knew that there was something about the value system there that didn't align with me. I'm a very sort of collective public servant type person at heart. And this very libertarian individualism at all cost mentality just somehow was clashing with who I was. And I told my parents at 15, I have to get out of this bubble. And they let me go overseas at 15 years old for a year. So I've always been this way. But the funny thing is, it doesn't mean that I want to forever live in a small one bedroom and not be financially comfortable. But I can't, I'm not me if I'm not fighting for what I believe in. And Lord knows it would be easier if I could sort of turn off the bigger picture. It would be so much easier. But it's not who I am. And it didn't really answer the question, but it's just like, it's the core of who I am. Every time I say, let me step back and do something more fun, first of all, I've always jumped into the biggest fires. I don't know why. I just always have. But right now, I think one of the biggest fires is the future of democracy, is the future of human rights, democratic principles. Like, these things are under threat, and I cannot remove myself from it. If you have the recipe for how to just have a more relaxing, go bake muffins instead, let me know, because I feel like you're similar. You also do not walk away from the core of what you believe you have to do.
Because you wouldn't be you, right? Like, when it matters, you actually have to stand up. I mean, so we talked about this briefly, but I think that this is one of those moments like, oh, well, Lord. So FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, on Jan 6, 1941, talked about these four freedoms, and he pushed it out to the world. On January 6, 2021, we watched what happened on Capitol Hill, and to show exactly how fragile these freedoms are in the United States. I feel like at this moment in time, we're hurtling towards, and I'm going to use a word I would never have thought I would use, towards fascism, right? Can you define what is happening, what you're working for, what is happening globally? Because it is a global.
It is global.
Yeah. So what is that? Why do you give up so much to work on this problem? What should we all be looking at?
I mean, maybe part of it, this might sound funny. I've never really said this when having this conversation before, but I wonder if part of it is also my Jewish upbringing of knowing where we come from.
Yeah, I was going to ask you that. Yeah.
And knowing how easy it is to slip. I mean, not to get too philosophical about World War II, but I guarantee you that a lot of people during that time believed that they weren't doing anything wrong. And then suddenly it got so far, or just were like, I'm going to bury my head in the sand. And what I see happening now, I'm not comparing it to that, but I do think that's ingrained in who I am as well. Like, you don't forget your history and you make sure history does not repeat itself. But I also find that more and more, it is just becoming easier to say, we won't talk about politics at the dinner table. We won't engage on politics. Don't discuss any of these issues because it will ruin all of our relationships. Well, wait a minute. How can you have a democracy if it is easier to bury your head in the sand or to pretend to not care about an issue because we can't talk to each other about these things anymore? And so it's always this breakdown in discourse has always been a huge concern for me. And it doesn't mean I think we should all get along. That's what also people don't understand. It doesn't mean we all need to be friends. But I truly, 5 years ago, this was the title of the piece that I wrote 6 years ago almost now, before I went to Facebook, when everyone thought I was crazy and this was super alarmist, was American hate is a bigger threat than foreign terrorism. I truly believe if we lose the vision of what it means to be all part of this democracy and we decide we fundamentally despise our neighbors more than we love our community, our country, our democracy, then it's over. And so that's very high level, but that's always been for the last 5 or 6 years what I've been fighting towards. Now it feels like a sort of bigger uphill battle, but now it's really how can we think about what a public square looks like? How can we think about a world where people can be empowered and feel safe to engage in these conversations, and it's not being run by a private entity who's controlling how billions of people view the world. These are public spaces. How do we make them public spaces again? What's the future of the public square? What's the future of democratic debate? These are the high level questions I'm looking at, but a lot of that will involve having to change the entire media landscape and figuring out how to make sure social media is also held to account for whether or not they're good stewards of the public square and of democracy.
Sadly, it's clear that they haven't been, and the jury is out whether they will be. They seem to be asking for legislation. At least that's what we're hearing. I guess, for the people watching, is there anything you see, anything they can do? I'm asked this question all the time in the Philippines, so what can we do? Like I have the magic answer, which I don't, right? But I mean, what can we do collectively?
Sure. I get asked this all the time too. And I also often say, why should the people who study it, unpack it, really help understand it, also be the ones who have to come up with every solution? But that said, I don't have the end all be all solution, but I do know that part of the problem is the closer you get to actually finding the solution, the more you're going to see this debate break down. So in terms of, they're in the US anyway, and let's be clear, I am a global thinker, but these companies, especially companies like Facebook, have been allowed to scale recklessly because of the permissive legal landscape here in the United States. We helped create this. I do believe it is our responsibility to help rein it in because it has now imposed its will on the rest of the world. So I just want to say that because people are like, why are you just talking about the US when it's affecting the whole world? Because I think it is on us, right, to help fix this. So with that in mind, it's clear the free market is not going to fix it. We're all about the free market in the United States. I have looked at it in terms of what can employees do? What can the free market do? I've looked at it from every angle. Without legislative and regulatory action, we're never going to, no matter how many new startups come along that try to fix this, no matter how much awareness happens, first and foremost, we need to even the playing field. I think there's 3 major things. And you'll hear tech policy people start to argue about which one is most important. No one of these things is going to suddenly make democracy flourish and all of us get along. But they're each a piece of the puzzle. Clearly, we need to step up and talk about what does federal privacy legislation look like. That is not my strongest area of expertise, but I recognize how important that is. Clearly, we need to think about what monopolies and competitive behavior looks like and how we can even the playing field there, which is done through antitrust here in the US. And the piece that I focus the most on is, unfortunately, Section 230 ends up being the debate, but I would like to step away from just that and say it's about accountability. In the United States, A company is allowed to grow, but when it starts to create externalities, the US government's job is to protect the public from those externalities, either by taxing them so much on the externalities that then they can offset it by paying for programs, or hopefully incentivizing the companies no longer to spill that oil all over the world, or by saying, here is how we're defining accountability. And if you break that, people can sue you for it. But right now, so for me, I do focus a lot on Section 230 in a very different way than most people do. And just, I'll give a 2-second, it's going to be more than 2 seconds, about what Section 230 is. But it is the law here that does two things. But the most important thing in my mind is it was written in 1996, before any of these companies existed. But on the one hand, it basically says that these companies can't be sued for the content that third parties post on their platforms. That's not the exact words, but that's essentially what it's saying, while also providing them protection to moderate content that they want. Okay, so why does this matter? Because they're not just the pipes through which information flows, right? It's not about that. I want to hold them accountable for how their recommendation engines are recommending people into extremist groups, into hate groups, into anti-vax groups, how their recommendation engines are connecting people, how their targeting tools are targeting us with either illegal or dangerous content, which we will define, right? It has nothing to do with free speech. It has to do with how these tools are working. So I focus a lot on that side of it. I think we need all three of those, though, to sort of reset so that we can start saying, if Facebook's not going to be the steward of the public square because they're never going to abide by these rules and regulations, then hopefully that opens the field for others to come along. And hopefully, I mean, again, I don't think our public square should be dominated by private for-profit interest only. It just shouldn't. I know that sounds really basic, but that's one of our big problems, I think. So anyway, we have a long way to go here in the US because there's a lot of money and power at stake when you're talking about these laws. So what does Mark Zuckerberg do? He starts running a huge ad campaign saying, we want legislation, or we want regulation, or whatever term he uses. And then he goes as far as to say, we support Section 230 reform. What was the strategy there? Oh, shoot. Well, if Mark Zuckerberg says he supports it, then it must be a terrible idea. And I see people falling for it. I see people who are true activists suddenly going, oh, wait, we can't touch Section 230 because if Mark Zuckerberg says he wants that to be amended, then I don't trust it anymore. No, he wants it amended the way he wants it. We should still amend it and update. I don't think we should get rid of it, but update Section 230 for the realities of the current situation. But I think it's a brilliant strategy from Facebook to say, we support regulation. Of course, there are certain pieces of regulation they're going to support. No question, because it takes the burden off them to have to report to their shareholders when they do certain things if they're doing it because it's the law. So in certain ways, sure, they do support regulation. But man, to say that they support Section 230 reform, wow, now I'm seeing activists on all sides suddenly backing away from wanting 230 reform because they don't trust it when Mark Zuckerberg says he wants it. It's their PR game is strong. And even some of the smartest journalists and activists get sucked into it and start to do Facebook's bidding for them without even knowing it, I think.
It's strange because it used to be, the world was clearer before social media, right? I now call it this behavior modification system, and it filters into everything else into the real world, the same way that online violence doesn't stay online, right? It moves into the real world. I think the last question, because we should close, is the Philippines knows what you are talking about really well. We've lived with it since 2016. We watched our society polarized. We watched not just division, but radicalization. Any advice for Filipinos watching this?
Oh, yeah. So I realized we didn't really get into the nitty gritty of radicalization online, which
Yes,
is
I know.
really kind of my whole thing. I realized that. Sorry. Some of it is really basic, unfortunately. So what I've written about and spoken about is now sort of in the public vernacular, but I was called alarmist and extreme at the time because I did talk about how social media was radicalizing people. I don't necessarily use the term polarize people. I have used that term before, but it's it's not social media that's necessarily polarizing us, right? We've always been polarized, especially in the US. And there's lots of debates about whether polarization in and of itself is a problem. But I do believe that is contributing to radicalizing people at a scale that did not exist before. When I was in the counter extremism world, I did a lot of sort of the hearts and minds work along the Somalia border and East Africa. I spent time pre-social media embedded in communities, having conversations with like radical imams and people who should really have like been told that I am someone they shouldn't be speaking to. And understanding the vulnerabilities of people who are susceptible to extremist messaging was my entire role. And it was always very clear. It was like certain communities who were marginalized, who felt the government didn't have their backs, essentially. I mean, there's certain denominators that always made us know this group is susceptible to extremist messaging. And how do we engage with this group to at least show them this is who we are? Let's engage before you decide that you believe these messages about us. In the social media world, that is next to impossible, right? Like I can't start engaging with each person that is being radicalized online, but it's what social media is doing, as much as people are arguing about this point right now, it has figured out how we are vulnerable. And the reason I talk about the vulnerabilities is that's how we were doing the hearts and minds work. They figure out your vulnerabilities, and then the messaging or the algorithm. Yes, Nick Clegg just wrote his big piece, VP of Facebook, about it's the algorithms are just figuring out who you already are. Yes, maybe I already had certain thoughts and certain feelings, but your algorithms have figured that out and are starting to recommend me into more and more extreme groups. You're deciding that because I'm a veteran who might be disillusioned right now as I'm struggling to enter civilian life, that maybe I want to learn more about the Proud Boys. Like, there's no question that is what was happening on Facebook. And so I would just recommend people it's hard work, but you have to recognize when you have an emotional reaction to something you see online. And you have to realize if you are having an immediate emotional reaction, stop and take a breath and think to yourself, this could very intentionally be designed to make me have an emotional reaction. And yeah, wonky, annoying headlines from like newspapers that just report stories is never going to grab your emotions the same way some of these other things do. But it's all about emotions and how we are being manipulated. So yes, human agency and all of that is important, but it's an unfair fight. Like this whole "it takes two to tango," that was Nick Clegg's title of his piece he wrote this week. And I wrote something about, well, so it takes two to tangle. One is a David who is using social media, and one is the Goliath who's using your human behavioral data to exploit your emotions and push you in certain directions. Those two to tango are not even. And so, sorry, that was like a long answer, but I think at an individual level, two things I tell people in the US, and I'm hoping it applies in the Philippines as well. One, you don't have to know how to write code, and you do not have to be an engineer, and you do not have to understand what the algorithms do or what the solution is. Well, in the US, I can say this. This may not apply in the Philippines. To say to your elected representative, I care about how this is affecting my children or our democracy, and I expect you to do something about it. Speak up, tell your representatives. And two, if you aren't in a country where that's going to be your path, then you have to figure out, is it worth it for me? I don't advocate getting off Facebook in the US, but in some other countries I would. but recognize, just more and more people need to recognize how their emotions are being exploited. Anytime I immediately want to scream at something I see on Twitter, I stop immediately and I start reading other stuff, and then I think about coming back to it. So I know that's like not the sexiest answer, but they're not going to build the friction in. We need to build it in ourselves into how we're engaging with it.
Fantastic. No, thank you so much. It's a lot of work, hard work ahead for us, but so important. Thank you so much for all you do, Yael. Guys, we will on the page put Yael's TED Talk, which tells you exactly how she's done this. This is a particular moment for the Philippines. I hope we come out okay. I'm Maria Ressa. Thanks for hashtag
Thank you.